special episode of the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Fry, and on today's show, we're looking back at the top 5 podcasts of 2021. At number 5, we have our episode from March, where we interviewed 2 experts about mass timber projects in BC. I talked to Hemsworth Architecture founder John Hemsworth and structural engineer Robert Malzik about mass timber and other wood-based technologies, focusing on the On5 4-story office building, which is in Vancouver's Mount Pleasant neighborhood. Here's a clip where Malzik explains both the mass timber technology used for On5 and the earthquake resilience built into the structure.
Regarding engineering innovation, there's quite a lot. So first of all, the passive house panels that John mentioned, they're also shear walls. But they're not only shear walls, they're also providing for vertical load support. So this is the first time ever in British Columbia that I'm aware of. The building on a zero load has vertical panels that support the load, support the live loads and the dead loads, of course. Mm-hmm. They are also a firewall, so they're calculated for charring, and they're also shear walls, so they are providing the lateral load resistance. And on top of it, they're fully prefabricated, so they will come like the big chunks of vertical walls together with the insulation, with the finishes, with the rain screen, and they will be connected from the inside with the splines that will have connections. And John came up with a system how to work it for the envelope and to make it watertight and safe. So this is number one. Number two is that I always wanted to as a structural engineer, to sit in a building that will self-center itself after an earthquake. So as you know, as structural engineers, we're really passionate about earthquake resistance, and we always looked at the load paths and how buildings behave before, during, after an earthquake. So typically an earthquake moves back sideways, and then a lot of times you have to demolish the building. Like in Christchurch, almost 10,000 buildings have been demolished. The building here, because of the system of hold downs developed by Pierre Canville, a Canadian who is now teaching in Auckland, New Zealand. So the system is a self-centering hold down. So after the earthquake will be, the building will be moved to one side or another, and then the hold down system will move it back into the so it will be able to have immediate occupancy. That's what all of us engineers, that's our buzzword. We want the buildings to be immediately able to be occupied after an earthquake.
Malzik and Hemsworth also worked on the Upper Skeena Recreation Center, which is a heavy timber and wood frame building in a fairly remote community that not only replaced a 44-year-old ice arena, condemned due to safety concerns, but became a new hub for the community. Here Hemsworth explains the challenges of building in a cold climate and how the project differed from On5.
That one started out from a different trajectory completely. Like Rob and I were working years ago on this idea that you could, because I mean, to back up for a second, most of this infrastructure across the country is coming to the end of its lifespan. The arenas, the ice rinks, all that kind of stuff. So there was a request by BC Wood to put together a prototypical arena, because generally they're built out of kind of steel frame buildings, and people say, oh, I'm a small community, I need to replace my arena. They go online, find a steel frame building, and they think that's the cost of it, but it's not, because there's no foundations, there's no ice plant, there's no insulation, there's no seating, there's no washrooms. So BC Wood asked us, and with Robert, obviously, to come up with a kind of prototypical scheme of how you could build these buildings roughly at the same cost of doing them in wood. The problem is, because it's a long span wood structure, you can't kind of get halfway through the steel design and then flip it into wood. So we spent some time early on looking at how to make a cost-effective long span glulam structure. And that's a long story of how we got there. It's quite a brilliant solution in the end, because the building works as more of an arch, and then it works as a kind of a single span. Spliced there's actually 3 beams across the top, 2 of them being cantilevered, and the third one being dropped in, zero moment at the splice point. So there's a whole bunch of ways of controlling the span. And then what we did is we put it together as a report, and it was released, I don't know, years ago. And by some fluke of the world, we had picked a small town, Hazelton in central BC, just to do the snow loading on the report. A year and a half later, we get a call from that town, who's a prominent doctor, Dr. Newberry, who's kind of putting together an approach of replacing his arena because of the social and economic issues in that part of the world, how to kind of build a locally based arena. So we didn't know he was looking to replace his arena. We just kind of picked New Hazelton as a place to get the snow loading. So what happened was the whole project leaped forward because now the schematic design was done. The structural system that Robert developed worked. And then we just basically added a gymnasium and a community room to the design of it. So it started out as a desktop project that I don't think anybody thought was actually going to be built. And now it's been finished. It's fairly well published at this point. We're very, very impressed and thrilled with having been involved in it. But mostly it's about the kind of capacity that it built within the community and the ability for that community, small community, to kind of marshal its forces and the people around it and build it. And one of the things that we did in the design was to panelize the wall and the roof panels, meaning just use standard lumber, all the insulations on the outside again. What this did is it created an opportunity for people to actually be able to work locally on the job. So instead of everything being shipped to these communities, we could put together a workforce using local labor to build those panels. And I believe the number is around 3,300 man days were done locally in this small community, which really kind of made the project not just economically viable, but socially viable too for a part of the world that struggles from an economic and a social point of view. So it's kind of winning on a whole bunch of different fronts for us on that project. Besides it, I think it's fair to say that it's stunning. It looks great. Like it's a really full building, which is kind of a nice byproduct in these things.
It's hard to remember now as time feels stretched out and the weeks and months meld together, but at the beginning of 2021, vaccines had barely started going in Canadians' arms, and inflation and supply chain issues had yet to make an impact on the wider economy. However, ConstructConnect chief economist Alex Carrick spoke to Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce national managing editor Vince Versace at the start of 2021 about the prospects for recovery from early COVID-19 shutdowns. In this clip, Carrick detailed why he was optimistic for economic recovery over the course of 2021. It's interesting to listen to his thoughts with the benefit of hindsight and another year's worth of experience as we continue to live through the pandemic.
I think the political situation is going to calm down a bit, especially in terms of our dealings with the United States because of the change in the election down there and so on. So again, we can get into that later. But the three ones that I primarily key on are, of course, the vaccine, because everything's flowing from coronavirus infections. Right now, the outlook for the economy has turned down in the last quarter of this year because there were reopenings of restaurants and so on, but they've had to be reversed. In a lot of cases, they had to be reversed because the vaccine came roaring back in the late fall and the winter. So having a vaccine and the promise of a vaccine out there, that's certainly a plus. And I suspect that maybe the vaccine will be disseminated and out there faster than we're being told. People always like to be conservative when they say this. There's a number of providers, and there's certainly going to be a lot of pressure on them to get the vaccine out. So when they talk about blanket coverage by the summer, maybe it'll happen a little bit sooner than that. But anyway, we've got to start seeing that curve go down, and having the vaccine is one really good development. Then a second one is there's a lot of talk about the savings rate. The fact that this is a number. It's a number that's published by statistical agencies and governments around the world, and it's actually a residual figure, so it's not really what you think it is. But nevertheless, the savings rate has shot up. At one point, in Canada and the United States. It was around 25% to 30% of disposable income. And there were two really big reasons. And one was that people haven't had anything to spend their money on. I mean, you haven't been able to go to concerts and entertainment or to dine out on Friday nights or the weekend or travel. And so that's one reason for people being able to pad up their bank accounts and so on. And then the other big reason has been that even though people have been laid off, the government has been pumping a huge amount of money into the economy. The government in Canada has given out all kinds of money to students beyond unemployment insurance. And in the States, it's been unemployment insurance, but then also stimulus checks. So when you look at the amount of income, that has shot up and the expenditures have gone down. So you got these really big savings rates. People have the money. Whether that'll be unleashed or not remains to be a bit of a question. But there's a lot of pent-up demand, and if you think about travel, a lot of people are addicted to travel. You hear people talking; they're just dying to get away on a trip or a vacation and so on. So once they feel confident that they can do it, that really will come back, partly because there's going to be the money to do it. And it's the same with eating out. I remember even this summer, I mean, my wife and I, we went out for a couple of meals this summer. Haven't done it since then, but man, when we sat there at the restaurant, we were sitting there and we had a waitress come over and take our order. We thought we were in heaven again. We were just delighted by that.
Right,
And then,
of course.
yeah. And then a third one might be that commodity prices are maybe starting to firm up again. And China, for example, has got a big infrastructure program that they're talking about, spending huge amounts of money. Now, it won't be in the same areas that they have in the past, or at least not to the same degree as in the past. It won't be things like roads and airports and so on. A lot of it will be on 5G networks and telecommunications systems and data center stacks and that sort of thing. So it's not entirely clear what that's going to mean in terms of commodity demand. But even oil prices, they're better than they have been for a while. And any improvement in commodity prices, it's a two-edged sword for construction. On the one side, all building materials are based on commodities. So if you have commodity price increases, you have the cost of construction going up. But there's another side to it. And I think that side's really more important for Canada now than worrying about the cost. And that is, when you have commodity price increases, the owners of resource projects, that's an incentive for them to go ahead with capital spending. And really, we haven't seen that in a decade. So those are the sorts of things where I think we can start to look a little bit more optimistically. And our dealings with the United States, that's an interesting subject too, in terms of the new administration now.
In April, Vince also interviewed Mark Casaletto, the outgoing president of ConstructConnect Canada. In this clip, Mark looks at how the construction industry in the world changed during his tenure with the company, the legacy of Canada's two media properties, the Journal of Commerce and Daily Commercial News, and how being part of the industry helped shape that change.
This time that I've had the absolute privilege of leading ConstructConnect Canada, if you look at the world, how much has changed in 15 years? We didn't have smartphones 15 years ago. Now we have smartphones. We didn't have 5G 15 years ago. Now we have 5G. We're consuming way more information. So the world was changing very quickly. The industry was changing very quickly, and we had to change a company. And we kept pace. In some cases, I think we got ahead of it a little bit and led the industry, and I'm proud of that. And I'm proud of being part of a team that had the faith in the company and me as a leader to be able to go on that journey. So.
Well, I've always thought one of the benefits we had as we embarked on this trajectory of growth and innovation is that we're from the industry. We're built from the industry as a company, from the DCN since 1927. You know what I mean? The JOC since 1911, right? Like, we're from it. So that's why I always felt like we kind of had this inside track in trying to understand our audience, our clients, our people. And I always felt like I'd watch you work, and it's like, there's a bit more partnership talk here than I would expect from an outsider trying to bring innovation into the industry. You know, did you ever feel like that was something that you could rely on? The fact that we were from it when you're trying to deliver the change to it. You know.
Well, one of the things I remember in 2005 when I started, and I had a little bit of advantage because when I came out of university, I started with Southern Construction Information Services, which owned the Daily Commercial and Journal of Commerce before Reed did. You know, so there's a long journey with ownership changes and stuff. But so as a young kid out of school, I was immediately baptized into understanding that the DCN and JOC had a long history, had a long legacy, had a tremendous amount of connection and goodwill. So there was a path there. So when I came back as an older kid, but still probably a kid in mindset, but an older man and to lead the business, you know, I had the respect that I felt a responsibility to everybody that came before me who got the DCN and JOC to where it was. And, you know, it's not a straight line, right? Like, it's a windy road. People do good things. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes things are out of your control. So we had a responsibility in 2005 to take this legacy, 1911 JOC, 1927 Daily Commercial News, data collection business that's been around since the 30s, analytics and statistics in Canada since the 80s, and everybody associated with it, and actually strengthen it and grow it. And it was not a job, it was a responsibility, because the industry relied on us, right? And so in integrating into the industry seemed natural because we were already part of the industry, and we just had to either rebuild bridges or strengthen them. And I think that was the focus early on, and it served us well.
In this next clip, Mark reflects on how the people he has worked with, both in the company and the wider industry, have made him a better person and a leader.
My dad used to say to me, never take for granted the moments that you don't realize where you are having an impact on somebody's life, whether it's only one meeting or whether it's a lifetime relationship. And never take for granted the moments that they have on you, because you're a function of the people you meet along the way. So those little moments you talked about, that one moment, if that had an impact on you, honestly, that is the greatest legacy that I could ever have. If I had that kind of impact on you in that moment, you know, that makes me extremely proud, because I can tell you that whether it's you, and definitely you, because obviously we've done a lot of things together over the years, or the broader employee base, or our colleagues in the United States, or the industry, a lot of people have had a lot of impact on me, and I'm a much better person today for having gone through that journey and made those connections and had those conversations than I would have otherwise. So I'm greatly thankful for that.
Our number 2 podcast of the year was another partnership with Naturally Wood from January, this time with architect Ray Wolfe of ThinkSpace Architecture, Planning, and Interior Design. He spoke about a report titled Design Options for 3- or 4-Story Wood School Buildings in British Columbia, prepared by ThinkSpace and FastNet. Wolfe talked about why high-density cities need taller wood-based institutional buildings like schools.
As we see sites in the urban areas getting smaller and tighter, you know, we're having to go vertical. And, you know, we're building, for example, Surrey Surrey's first three-story elementary school here right now that'll be coming out to the market fairly shortly. We're in construction documents. And, the idea of using products and materials that are local just makes a lot of sense. Reduces transportation. It helps with carbon sequestering. It helps with trying to, look at targets such as net zero carbon and net zero operating and energy. So there's just a whole bunch of good reasons why, clients are coming to us with goals around healthy buildings and projects that allow vertical, them to be vertical, but also create, beautiful buildings for the same kind of construction points that we have been building in the past.
And with schools, are there any, I assume there are, special considerations with schools that you wouldn't have with, say, other institutional buildings? And then how does wood sort of translate into that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting what we've learned in our last report that we did for Woodworks BC. We were working with a co-consultant. There's been a bunch of research in and around how to deal with assembly occupancy buildings and doing them in mass timber. And then there's a bunch of research that you can check out. The building code doesn't really address using combustible material in an assembly occupancy of a certain size. And that's where we've been talking to authorities having jurisdiction. And, we've got a number of projects, both in post-secondary and K-12, that are doing assembly occupancy buildings using combustible materials such as mass timber as the main structural framing system. And so it takes a lot of kind of knowledge sharing and discussions with the fire departments within those authorities having jurisdiction, with the planners and the inspectors to walk them through why we're meeting the performance criteria of the building code, even though the building code doesn't have a prescriptive nature for the kind of mass timber buildings that we're building. And I think you're going to see the building code change. I think it's going to adopt it as there's more in the market and authorities become more familiar with how to build in mass timber within the assembly occupancy realm.
In April this year, we embarked on a series about surety and bonding, and part one of that series is our most popular podcast of the year. I talked to Werfold's partner and lawyer, Krista Chator, FCA Insurance Brokers Vice President of Construction Practice, Jamie Cullum, and Smart Built Construction Solutions founder, Malik Zuckerman. In this clip, all three of them look at the Ready for Takeover milestone, which replaced the idea of substantial performance, with some difference of opinion on how the rule changes affect their sectors of the industry.
Keep in mind with the Ready for Takeover is, I guess, I totally hear Zulk's statements about there being more issues for the contractor, and it's not the first time that I've heard it, that's for sure. But there is something good about this new concept, which is that it addresses sort of a misalignment, and again, at least this is in Ontario, between the requirements or the concept of substantial performance under our Construction Act versus a contractual issue of substantial performance. And so the idea of using a different term for a contractual milestone versus a milestone under the Construction Act, in theory, I like that because in my mind, it can resolve some confusion about whether or not you're talking about meeting requirements under the Construction Act or meeting requirements under your contract. So that part maybe is something that that the committee got right in terms of making there be a difference.
I'm going to jump in there. Where is the difference? They're still saying you have to meet substantial performance of the work. So you're still dealing with the Lien Act. And now you've got another layer of complexity, requirements for occupancy. That's the consultant.
Yeah.
So I don't know that you've cleaned it all up. I think you've muddied the water even further because everyone understood the 3-2-1 rule. It was a mathematical calculation. So it was easy. Math is definable. It's black or it's white. There's very little gray in math, but the rest of it now gets gray.
So that math still counts for the Construction Act. But it has, it was always open to people in supplementary conditions to create different rules for substantial performance of the contract and contractual remedies. So I'm not sure that using a different term for the contractual issue is necessarily a bad idea. I think one thing that's going to cause confusion, in addition to what you just said, Zulk, is that the way this section is set up requires a look back to other contract documents. So you talked about cleaning up the site, Zulk, and it's going to be, someone's going to have to go back and look and see what exactly is required in the contract documents for that. What exactly is required in the contract documents for O&M manuals. So you kind of have to, go into two places or more than two places and look at what's required. And that's sort of, in my mind, a bit of an inefficiency. Some of these things, a bunch of these things, training and that sort of thing, the manuals, even cleaning and waste removal, that's as required by the contract documents.
Yeah, but the challenge I see that's going to happen is you're going to be left at the end of a job where everyone's done playing nice with each other. Everybody really wants to leave a job. And we're not talking about the jobs that last 2 or 3 months. We're talking about the jobs that last, 6 months to 2 or 3 years. And the specs that are typically provided to most contractors are probably older than the three of us put together on the call. Sorry, Warren, don't know how old you are. So maybe
50, so no worries there.
All right. So a lot of these spec writers, I'm seeing stuff, the remnants from the 70s. And I was a twinkle in somebody's eyes in the early 70s. So they haven't updated their specs. So there's going to be all this gray area that's going to be created because this new takeover, ready for takeover procedure says, hey, by the way, take a look at these other 6 areas of the specifications. And whatever it says in these other 6 areas, those will also apply. And knowing that the problem is always with whoever's writing these specs, that's not going to catch up. So instead of streamlining stuff, you've actually now created a twisted web between the ready for takeover procedures and the people who can't write specs anyways. And listen, I'll point it out. You've got consultants and engineers, or sorry, I should say architects and engineers that have been using boilerplate specifications that are outdated. They don't apply anymore. They're not coordinated. They don't make a lot of sense. And when it suits them, if it works, use the specs. And it doesn't work for them, well, that's not what we meant. Use this part of the clause. So until somebody can go up and clean up all of those items, really, substantial performance, like I said, after over $1 billion worth of construction, I've only had one issue getting substantial performance. And I walked out of the meeting in 5 minutes. I just said, you don't want to give a substantial? No problem. Here's all the keys. And I just walked out of the building. Said, thank you. Have a good day. And you quickly catch everyone's attentions. And I'm not suggesting that people should exercise that right, but you have that right in a contract. You're not happy? No problem. See you later. We'll walk away. We'll sort it out at a later date. But saying, hey, you got to hit the 3-2-1 rule. Oh, by the way, you got to get occupancy. And I would say 95% of the times, the reason we couldn't get occupancy when we had the building inspector was a design-related issue. So once again, how is that the contractor's fault?
Jamie, what's your take on all this?
Yeah, so, well, I will say I agree with Zulk there on, and we see that a lot. We spend a lot of time going through tender documents and reading contracts, and it is not uncommon to find specifications that don't really make any sense. And I would say the copy and paste button is unfortunately a favorite tool sometimes in our industry. And so I can see where the confusion does lie here. And it's something we've heard from lots of contractors over the last couple of months is what's good in this contract for us, right? And I've had people even say, was there any contractors represented at this table? Unfortunately, contractors are typically at the buyer's whims here, right? You want a job, you sign a contract, and you have to follow the contract, and that's part of being a contractor. So it's an unfortunate reality, I think, but hopefully, I think the goal of this, and CCDC would probably agree, and Chris would probably agree, is just to provide more clarity across the board for contractors, so that and owners and consultants really, but so everybody knows what's expected.
That's our top 5 pods of the year. Thanks for joining us in 2021, and we look forward to bringing you more podcasts and great interviews in 2022 and beyond. We've included links to the pods inserted here in our show notes, and you can listen to the Construction Record on the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce websites, as well as Apple Music, Amazon, and Spotify Music. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.